Good morning and welcome to the David and David on Real Estate podcast. David Korman, good morning. Welcome.
Good morning. It's great as always to do one of these podcasts with you. Looking forward to our discussion this morning. This should be great. We got some new breaking news in the industry, David. So why don't you tell us, give us a little intro? We can get into it.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, David. This one has been long anticipated, I think, by a lot of stakeholders. It's a topic that's been in discussion for a long time. It's a very topical topic. We're hearing so much about tenants, about landlords, about pain points that both groups are feeling. And we finally had the provincial government step up in a big way, in my opinion, and pass a bill. It's called Bill 60, that really aims on solving some of these issues and addressing some of the concerns that both sides have been feeling for a while.
Yeah, and Bill 60. This came about. It was part of the election campaign. There was a lot of talk on it when Ford called the election. Like this was one of the things that he said Ontario really needed, and it was hard for the other parties to say no, we don't need it. Maybe they'll just maybe do it differently. But the idea is, we need some legislation passed on which is all sort of encompassed in this one Bill 60, which was actually called the Fighting Delays Building Faster Act. It's such a weird name for legislation, Fighting Delays Building Faster Act. But that's sort of what it is. So the first part that we're going to focus on this morning is really talking about residential landlord rent controls and issues facing that and all the problems that they're trying to solve some of that as part of this legislation. And then they're just the other parts of the legislation we'll talk in subsequent podcasts is really focus more about um, we have a shortage of housing in the province. We have a shortage of housing in the nation, but in particular in the province, and particularly in the big urban centers, GTA, always is a focus. And what can the government do to improve that system and get the development done faster, get more affordable housing, et cetera. So that's Fighting Delays Building Faster Act, which is a bit of a mouthful. But first, for this podcast, we're gonna focus more on the landlord tenant side of it and the rent control side of it. Not rent control, that's a bad word, but it's the relationship between landlords and tenants.
Yeah, and David, I think the first point that we have to jump into, which this bill deals with, is the fact that there's shorter timelines for scheduling LTB hearings, and this was really rampant during COVID. We heard that people trying to get in front of the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is the mechanism for landlord disputes and tenant disputes, was 9 months, 12 months, even past some of those timelines. So this bill, the first thing that it really aimed to do is to shorten those timelines.
Yeah, and the current law, that they're trying to improve upon became over time very tenant oriented. And landlords were really struggling. And if you don't have landlords and people investing in real estate and becoming landlords and be comfortable and have some certainty as landlords, understanding clear rules about their rights and have the courts protect the landlords, right, then they want out of the business and they get out and it creates this shortage. So they realized the scale got too tipped in favor of tenants. It was too hard. Tenants were taking advantage of the system and making it really difficult for anybody to be a landlord. So a tenant could be not paying rent, it could be not complying with notices to leave when a landlord required the property for their own personal use and just ignoring it or fighting back and delaying it. So this is intended to shorten all the timelines and balance the scales a little more, flip it more to the landlord's point of view. So that shortening all the scheduling of the hearing, improving the system, getting more adjudicators because you couldn't get a hearing because there weren't enough people available to adjudicate on the hearings. So they got to spend some money to improve that system too and get people in and out of these hearings faster, give the landlord a little bit more certainty that the laws are going to be upheld and they can, get in and out faster. So I think that's sort of what's behind this.
Yeah, and it's such a delicate issue, David, because I find that it's always few select tenants that ruin it for everybody, and we have these, I call them institutional tenants that really take advantage of the system. And we see this all the time. Tenant pays their first and last, they move into the property, no other rent is payable, and it takes 12 months to evict them and pay basically for the fee of first and last month's rent. They stay in these rentals free for 12, sometimes 14 months before the end of the eviction actually happens. And it's these type of situations that really give everybody a bad name. And I think when I look at the underlying text of this new bill, this is really what it aims to combat in a big way. So things like, tenants now have to pay 50% of the rent owned before raising certain arguments in front of the LTB.
Right.
Standardized forms and procedures to simplify application processes. And then the bill also aims to expedite eviction orders once a decision is made at the LTB. There's a lot of mechanisms that are being put in place to really address the bad tenants out there.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Like you don't want to paint everybody in the same brush, but I think you're right. I don't know what the percentage is, but I would guess, 80% of tenants, 90% of tenants are probably good and they just want to be tenants, look after the
I
property,
think
they're
it's even
fine.
higher than that, David. I think the
Yeah,
majority of tenants are good.
right. And the same thing with landlords. Most landlords are not slum landlords. It's the few slum landlords that give all landlords a bad name, and it's a smaller percentage of tenants that are creating the real issues here. But the issues are serious enough that like I've got a concrete example in our office how it drove clients of mine out of the landlord business, the residential landlord business. They owned a few properties. They put a group together of investors, bought a few properties with tenants in them, and it all worked fine for a while. They were getting decent income from it. They complied as landlords to fix the property up. They complied as landlords with the rent control and only adjusted based, so they were doing the right thing as landlords. For the most part, they had some good tenants, but a few bad tenants started to sour them. And then a couple of the investors just sort of needed to divest themselves, needed to cash out. So they decided they're going to sell a property that had three tenants in it. And they found a buyer that actually wanted to convert this property back into a single use, single family property and use it for their own family. So they
Wow.
needed this, and it was legit. It wasn't, and that's the problem because some of these things are not legit. That they're buying it for their own use and they issue the notices, and then it turns out they're just going to rent it at a higher rent somewhere else. But,
Right.
but this was legit. They had a buyer who wanted to buy it but needed it vacant. So the landlord gave them more than the required notice and offered to pay them. We're obligated to give you a month's rent because that's what the legislation was. So they did everything to a T, beyond a T. They gave more notice, right? And the response they ended up getting from the tenants was they went to like a legal aid type lawyer that wasn't charging anything but was working on a contingency basis. And the lawyer said, no, let me talk to your lawyer. I'll find a way to get you more time to stay and get you some money out of this. And the lawyer calls me up and basically starts extorting the landlord. This is how much money we want for this tenant. This is how much money we want for that tenant. This is how much money for this tenant. And I said, well, no, you're not entitled to any of that. Like we complied with the law. We gave you notice. We gave it the buyer legitimate, we're moving to our closing date. We need it vacant. Well, we're going to screw up your closing.
Oh my God.
We're just not leaving. So if we don't leave, your closing's not going to happen. Maybe you can get an extension for your closing, but we'll extend. We'll screw it up. This by the time you take us to court and get a judge to evict our clients in the middle of winter from all the delays that we can do, we're going to screw up your closing. So you want to go that route, go ahead. Otherwise, pay this client 25,000. This one wants 18,000. This one wants 22,000. Pay us that extortion money, basically, and we'll agree to leave. And my
Yeah,
client did because they weighed all their options and they said, no, we
wow.
got to get out. And if we don't, and this deal falls apart, who knows about the next deal? and the price we're going to get if it goes back on the market, et cetera, et cetera. So they agreed to pay. So a lot of the profit that they had been earning over their ownership period, they just handed back to the tenants, just to
And
get
see,
out.
David, I have a big problem with that situation. That is extortion. It should be illegal. You
100% extortion. And they knew it. But it was like, okay, take us to the landlord tenant. By the time you get us there, and then we delay, and then we're going to screw up your transaction. And
Does the landlord have any repercussions after closing to go after the buyers for extortion personally, the tenants for extortion personally?
well, if the landlord agrees to pay them, and we had to put it, draft an agreement in writing where we agreed to pay them X dollars by a certain date and put the money in trust. And then they left. And once the landlord went in and confirmed that they were out and without damage, one of them left a bunch of stuff and damaged the property. So we had an ability to claw back a little bit of it for that. But we had an agreement in writing, for them to leave. So the other option is, them is go to the landlord and tenant to try and get an order to evict them, but till you get into court in those days, because the time periods were so long. So now this new legislation is intended to help a landlord in that situation. No, they're not going to be able to drag it out 6 months. Like, you could get in a short period of time, enforce your rights. They even took away the landlord no longer has to pay that. They have to
One
give
month
more
rent.
notice, but they don't have to pay that one
Yeah.
month's payment,
Yeah, with
right?
120 days notice. I saw that. Yeah.
But this lawyer said, like, forget the 1 month's payment. We want 6 months payment. Like,
Right.
you know,
No, it's a crazy story, but it really illustrates how broken the system is and how tenants were completely abusing it in their favor, right? So, there is a legal process, and this is nothing short of extortion. What you just described is nothing short of extortion, and it pains me that the landlord had to go through this whole process and pay this money. But I think a lot of people will look at the situation and say, well, the landlord probably gained hundreds of thousands of dollars to the ownership of this asset. So if he has to pay the tenant a little bit, it's the cost of doing business. But of course, the law should be made in a way where it's not abused and it's followed. And when it is followed, that there's principles there that protect both sides, right? So here, the protection for the tenant is that they're owed 1 month rent, they're owed 90 days notice, and that's what the law sort of protects them.
yeah. And I'm not against protecting tenants. Like, I just happen to be on the landlord side of that transaction. So I want tenants protected too. And I get it that you're giving a tenant who's that's where they're living. And if all of a sudden the landlord can come to a tenant and give, 60 days, 90 days notice, hey, we sold the building, someone buying it to use it themselves, thanks for being a great tenant, you have to leave now. That's not great, especially when you're putting them out now and they got to go find another place to live. And we already talked about there's a shortage of rental properties.
Yeah.
So from a tenant's point of view, like, where am I going to go? And I'm going to pay more rent than I'm currently paying wherever I go. And it's hard for me to find a thing. Got to pay moving costs. There's a lot of disruption to a tenant. So I get that. So this new legislation gives the tenant more time. So that's a good thing. But it depends on the market that you're dumping them into. Now, if the government is successful in creating a lot more affordable housing and rental opportunities, it's an easier decision for a tenant to just say, okay, I'm not going to try and extort the landlord and stay. I'm going to just leave because I can go to a lot of places and pay similar rent. But we have to give the tenant those choices too.
Yeah. And that's an excellent point that you bring up, David. Like the impact here is so psychological, right? Like we need investor confidence to build more houses to increase supply, which will give tenants more options, which will lower rental rates. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up is that um, faster evictions don't necessarily mean unfairness. Because if you can go through the process faster and make these decisions in a more timely manner, it's going to impact the tenants that, really do need the help with the bad landlords. Because there are bad landlords out there. And, I can share a story on this. We had a staff member. a couple years ago that rented a basement apartment, and their landlord turned off their air conditioning because they constantly had guests that were staying at the house. Their friends that were staying overnight, and they weren't on the rental application. And after a number of warnings, the landlord took it upon themselves to create enforcement measures. And in the middle of the summertime, decided that they're going to create enforcement by turning off the AC. Right. So situations like that, going through the LTB faster and getting dealt with faster, by the time that tenant would submit an application to the LTB, summer would be over and the issue would become a moot point with
Right.
the AC being turned off, right? But the
Then they
whole
got to
point of
turn off the heat.
right, right. Well, hopefully they don't do that, right? Because I
Right.
mean, there's serious repercussions to that. That's a human rights issue. But
Right.
when I heard that situation, I was shocked because there was no mechanism where, anybody can really step in and help this person in a timely manner.
Right. So it's only going to work if they hire a lot of people, right? Because you'd have to be able to get someone to maybe physically come to that place and say, oh, yeah, there's supposed to be 4 people living here, and it looks like there's 8 people living here. So we're going to issue an order, to that 4 people have to leave by this date. And if they don't comply, then what? Like there has to be some teeth to it and ability to enforce that. And so we're gonna have to see, if the enforcement mechanisms that are built into this have more teeth in favor of a landlord to the point that it's going to get those. And again, we're talking about a small percentage of tenants that don't comply,
Mhm.
but we can't have the law be an invitation to those people to just, use the system to their advantage. Okay. So there has to be some teeth in this, but they have to hire a lot of people. There have to be more judges. They have to be able to send people out to the properties to see the conditions themselves. You know, there's always going to be an inherent fairness to the system because there's still going to be an opportunity to go to court, and the tenant can present all their evidence and plead with the judge, and so can a landlord. So, but they need to get in a timely fashion, and and then once a decision is made, there has to be a timely mechanism, an enforcement mechanism with whatever the order is,
Yeah.
and then create more certainty in the system.
I think this situation is going to create a situation where tenants get more paralegal or legal representation, which I think is going to add to the whole professionalism of maintaining the system. And
Mhm.
I think there's going to be an opportunity here for both realtors, for the public to get more educated and to start working together and start moving forward in a more meaningful way and really supporting each other through this process.
Yeah, and that's an important point too, David, because like in our office, we get asked to get involved in these landlord tenant situations all the time. Some of the landlord sites, some of the tenant site, and we have to go through a process explain that we don't actually do that as lawyers. First of all, we don't do litigation in our firm, but even if we did, I don't know any litigation lawyers to refer these people to because litigation lawyers do not want to do landlord and tenant tribunal things. Years ago, we had a lawyer that actually shared space with us for a period of time, and he was doing some landlord and tenant things as part of his practice. And I asked, like, how can you do it? You can't charge enough money, like his hourly rate, whatever it is. You couldn't charge any litigation, can't charge a regular hourly rate to do this. It takes so much time to get a hearing, to get in, to sit around all day, to wait for your 10 minutes, and then it gets adjourned, and then you got to come back another time, and then something else happens, and then the tenant says, "Oh, I need this." Okay, we'll adjourn. We'll come back in 30 days. You're back for it. So litigation lawyers don't want to do it. They can't make a living going to the tribunal. So it's paralegals. And the system's designed so you don't even need really a paralegal to do it because a tenant could walk in on their own and and plead with the judge and get a favorable order. So maybe that's going to change, and it might be great for the paralegal industry. I don't see this is going to drag litigation lawyers into it yet. Maybe if they know it's really becoming a stronger more like a court system. But I think litigation lawyers are still going to shy away. So it's the paralegals, and we'll see what happens. Because it could be a great business for paralegals.
Yeah, David, I think, I think there's a certain reputation among lawyers. I think you guys went to school for a long time. You guys have really invested in your brand and your reputation. I think there's a certain aura and a prestigious of being a lawyer. And I think the inconsistency of LTB decisions among cases, makes it really difficult for you to represent a client in a meaningful way, and uphold your reputation to the utmost level. It's, when you have a similar issue, you go in front of an adjudicator, and that decision is adjudicated in a different way because of how much emotion the client shows. It's really hard to say as a lawyer, well, you know what, I've represented you to the best of my ability, and pay me this amount of money now because I've done it, and I'm sorry you didn't get a favorable outcome because the person, or the person presenting against you had a certain emotional argument, right? And I think that we're seeing that on a massive scale, and I think that's what makes it the most difficult.
Yeah, no, it's hard. And I get it, why judges would lean towards tenants, especially, you try and evict someone in the middle of winter, and I don't care what the tenant did or how far the tenant was in default and however all the facts are against the tenant. But the judge is going to say to the tenant still, okay, I'm issuing an order that you got to leave in 30 days, but that would be, the day before Christmas. And so I'm not going to make you leave then. So let's push it to the new year. I'll give, instead of 30 days, I'll give it 60 days in January. Is that okay? And then the tenant says, well, it's really hard, middle of January to find a place. So can you give me till March? And then the judge would say, okay, how about April? Like and the landlord's just sitting on the sidelines and they're negotiating, like what's going to be easier for a tenant. So I get that because a tenant, you don't want to throw a tenant out on the street in the middle of
No, you don't.
winter, but at some point, well, like the landlord's got an interest there too.
Yeah.
So, the landlord has to have some certainty and some, that the law is going to be upheld too, or people aren't going to want to be landlords.
Yeah. And I think the biggest point, just to end on this, David, but I think the biggest point is that now, any new issue that's brought up by a tenant, is going to necessitate them paying 50% of the outstanding rent owing before the start of the tribunal case. And I think this
Right.
is huge. Because if tenants don't show good faith and they just say, hey, I didn't pay my rent because I didn't feel like it, or because there's all these issues that I'm gonna
Right.
like just rhyme off, and think they're going to go in front of the judge and plead their case. Well, it sounds like there's going to be an automatic mechanism now that if you haven't made that gesture of good faith and you haven't shown that good faith before the start of your hearing, then it's going to be an automatic ruling against them, which is what it sounds like. And I think that's going to bring a lot of clarity and transparency, and prevent tenants from utilizing the system to their benefit, taking advantage of it.
Yeah. Well, we'll see, because I could just I don't want to be pessimistic, but I hope this works. But I could just see an order like that going against tenant because they didn't pay their 50%. So basically, the landlord gets a default judgment, and then the tenant appeals that because there'll be an appeal mechanism and say, I couldn't get the 50% by that date, but now, Judge, I have it. So I want to appeal that and get that overturned. So you're back in court 30 days later because now I have the money. And the judge says, okay, well, if you have the money, then I'll set a hearing. And they're just find another way to delay the process, right? So I hope that doesn't happen. But based on the way the system's been abused so far, that's what's going to happen. There'll be that small percentage of tenants and their legal aid counsel encouraging them to find a way to use the system again. So I hope it's done properly.
David, you had to ruin it for us. You had to ruin it for us at the very end of the episode. I was just getting so excited about all these changes, but you're right. I mean, there's a legal process and we have to respect it.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope all this works. I think, at the end of the day, if this works, it helps the landlords. but it also helps the tenants. Like having more certainty, having a system that works better is ultimately better for all parties.
Yeah, and I can't say enough about the psychological effect of, encouraging more investors to get in, encouraging more mom and pop landlords to own rental properties, because that's really what increases the supply in a big way,
Yeah.
brings down rent prices, makes more affordable rentals, and creates a great situation. Like so many of us, started off when we first migrated to Canada in a basement apartment and lived with another family that we loved and we respected and got along. And it's such a big identity of the Canadian way of living. So,
Yeah.
I hope that confidence gets restored. I hope the mom and pop landlord, which is big for me because, I love real estate as a wealth building tool, right, for the average Canadian. So I think we need to encourage that. And I hope this bill does that in a big way.
It hope so too, because like this was needed. Like there's no question this was needed. Like everybody agrees there's a shortage of rental housing, and the only way you're going to have encourage more people to build rental housing and be landlords for rental housing is to make sure they have enforceable rights too. So I welcome this, and hopefully they'll figure out all the nuances and the ways that it can be used, and it works because then it's fair for both sides,
Yeah.
and we'll get more rental housing. We're all better off.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Another great episode on the David and David on Real Estate podcast. Drop us your comments, drop us your questions, and let us know. Like, if you're considering a rental property, is this bill enough? Does it give you enough confidence to jump in? And if you currently have a rental property, you've been thinking about selling it, then does this bill give you enough confidence to stay in the game and keep going? Thank you so much, and join us next episode as we continue diving and unpacking this bill because there's so much more to get into. We're going to get into building houses faster, and then we're going to also do an episode on the development charges because that is also a big part of this equation.
Looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, everyone.